What would you do if the person you trusted most stood beside you in triumph, only to erase you in silence, not with loud betrayal, not with slammed doors or bitter words, but by walking into a room full of your dreams, hand in hand with someone else? Camille Rayner had built her life with quiet strength behind the scenes, behind the success, behind a man the world called brilliant. She gave him her loyalty, her brilliance, her heart, and just when she thought they were building a legacy together, she discovered she was being written out of it. What happens when you realize your silence has been mistaken for weakness, when love becomes strategy, and betrayal wears a tuxedo? If you were her 8 months pregnant, forgotten, humiliated, would you crumble, or would you rise? This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about choosing your voice when everyone expects you to disappear. So, take a deep breath and ask yourself one more question. If you had one night to reclaim your story, would you be ready? If this resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this one to life. Now, let's begin. The Whitmore Hotel in Manhattan had always held a certain hush about it, a kind of old money dignity that didn't need to prove itself with logos or neon lights. On this particular Friday night, the grand ballroom glowed like the inside of a snow globe, dusted with golden light from the chandeliers and murmurs of wealth in designer suits and dresses that cost more than a schoolteacher's yearly salary. It was the annual Stratus Ventures Gala, a celebration not just of profits and partnerships, but of power, the kind of event where the wine is older than the interns and every handshake has a subtext. At the center of it all stood Thomas Rayner, the charismatic CEO of Stratus Ventures. His silver cufflinks gleamed with intention, and his smile was rehearsed to look effortless. At 45, Thomas had the kind of confidence that came from a long track record of success and from always being the smartest man in the room, or so he believed. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but the real statement wasn't in the cut of the fabric. It was in who was on his arm. Her name was Lena Hartley, 24, with red lips and dark eyes that lingered just a beat too long on anyone who looked at her. She wore a crimson silk gown that shimmered like temptation itself, but she wasn't just a pretty face, and that was what made her dangerous. Lena was smart, hungry, and willing to play whatever role the moment required: assistant, muse, or trophy. And tonight, she played her part well. The moment they entered, there was a collective shift in the room, not a gasp, not a stir. These were seasoned professionals, after all, but a quiet tilt. Heads turned just slightly. Conversations slowed. The unspoken code had been broken. This wasn't Thomas's wife. Everyone knew Camille Rayner, of course, the poised, brilliant woman with a background in behavioral economics. She was known for her grace and her glowing pregnancy 8 months along, last anyone had heard. A woman quietly resting, far from the glitz of the night. And yet, here Thomas was with Lena. He didn't care, or maybe he wanted them to know. He leaned in toward Lena with a low chuckle, guiding her through the crowd like a man guiding his legacy. They were magnetic. She whispered something in his ear, and he laughed louder than necessary. A few executives exchanged glances. One woman tightened her grip on her wine glass. The room was beginning to feel too warm. At the bar, Mason Drew, the CFO of Stratus Ventures, stood with a glass of bourbon, eyes narrowed. He had seen the numbers. He had seen the shifts in expense reports, the quiet funneling of funds into an R&D project with no name and no results. And now, this. He didn't say a word. Not yet. Elsewhere in the room, Elliot Vaughn, chairman of the board, stood still as stone. Tall, silver-haired, with a face carved by decades in the highest rooms of power. He watched Thomas like a hawk circling from above, saying nothing. But his silence was not the same as indifference. As Thomas mingled and toasted, Lena stayed close, always just a touch behind him. At one point, she bent to whisper, "Do they know who I am?" Thomas grinned. They will by the end of the night. He loved the attention. He drank it like champagne quickly and with the assumption that there'd always be more. But what he didn't notice, what he never noticed, was what wasn't said. The smiles that didn't quite reach eyes. The way some men pulled their wives a little closer, the stiff nods, the cautious laughter. Because somewhere, beneath all the gloss and glamour, everyone was waiting for something, or someone, and Thomas, for all his charm, had forgotten the most dangerous truth of all. The quietest person in the room is often the one writing the ending. The Rayner residence sat quietly on the Upper East Side, tucked behind a row of manicured hedges and a wrought iron gate. It was the kind of house people passed and wondered about, grand, without being loud, elegant, without being indulgent. Inside, light poured through high windows, casting long shadows across a room that felt both warm and cold at once. Camille Rayner sat in the nursery. It wasn't finished yet. The soft cream walls had been painted months ago, and the crib had arrived 2 weeks early. There were tiny clothes, folded neatly in drawers, untouched. A rocking chair near the window creaked softly when she moved, not from motion, but from memory. She ran her hand along the edge of the crib, her fingers pausing on a carved star in the corner. Thomas had picked it out in a catalog, said it reminded him of a dream he once had about their future. That was before the silence, before the space between them grew into a canyon. Her belly shifted gently under the knit sweater she wore. 8 months, almost to the day. She was alone tonight, not because she wanted to be, but because she had not been invited. The Stratus Gala was the event she used to help plan, used to attend with pride. She had been the quiet force behind Thomas's rise, the strategist who refined his boldness into brilliance, but not anymore. Now she was resting. That was the word he'd used. You need rest, Camille. This pregnancy has been tough on you. It hadn't been, not really. What had been tough was the way he stopped looking at her like she was part of the world they built together. Tough was the way he made decisions without asking. Tough was the quiet click of the door when he left for the gala and didn't say goodbye. She had known about Lena Hartley for weeks, maybe longer. Not from confrontation or betrayal, Camille was far too perceptive for that. She saw the shift, in his schedule, in his scent, in the way his phone stayed face down. But she hadn't exploded. She hadn't cried. Instead, she'd taken long walks around the block, read old letters he wrote when they were still dreaming, talked to their unborn child in the quiet of the night. And most of all, she had listened. Listened to her instincts, to the way her heart beat, not with panic, but with clarity. It was strange, what silence could teach you. It could feel like abandonment, or it could feel like a pause before something important. Tonight. Camille sat in that silence like a woman waiting not for someone to rescue her, but for the moment she knew was coming. She opened the small drawer in the corner of the nursery and took out a file folder. Inside were photographs, printouts, email records. Nothing dramatic, no scandalous texts, no compromising pictures, just patterns, dates, transfers, signatures. She hadn't needed a private investigator. She was one, in a way. Her field, behavioral economics, was all about decisions, motivation, risk. She could see through smiles, map out patterns of fear disguised as ambition. And Thomas's patterns were clear now. He wasn't just straying, he was running. From age, from responsibility, from the company they'd built together, from the life that was about to change forever. But he was running toward a cliff. She had tried to warn him once, weeks ago, asked him quietly if everything was all right. He laughed, said she worried too much, told her not to let hormones cloud her logic. That was when she knew he was gone, not physically, not yet, but emotionally, ethically, completely. And still, she hadn't crumbled. Camille had never been the type to fall apart, even when her parents passed within months of each other. Even when her first business failed and they had to live in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery in Brooklyn, she had always rebuilt, always turned grief into architecture. This would be no different. Her hand moved to her belly again, instinctively. The baby kicked gently. A soft hello. She smiled, a quiet expression, barely there but real. This child didn't know yet what kind of world it was about to enter. But Camille did, and she would make sure it was a world worth arriving in. A soft knock came at the door. She stood slowly, crossed the hallway to open it. It was Elliot Vaughn. His presence was calm, like the hum of a deep cello note. No words yet, just eyes that had seen enough to know when a storm was coming. He looked at her, really looked. "You ready?" he asked. Camille nodded. "Everything's in place." She handed him the folder. Everything. Elliot held the folder, heavy with more than paper. "You sure you want to do this tonight?" he asked. Voice low, careful. Camille's gaze moved past him, out the window where the city lights shimmered like promises. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. "I'm not doing it for revenge," she said. "I'm doing it so I can sleep again. So this child can have a father. It doesn't have to unlearn." Elliot nodded once, and then they left. Together. Toward the gala. Toward the reckoning. The gala had reached that perfect hum, a blend of vintage jazz and the clink of champagne flutes, of practiced laughter and exchanged glances. This was the hour where deals were sealed, not with signatures, but with smiles. Thomas Rayner moved through the ballroom like a conductor directing an invisible orchestra. He was magnetic, firm handshakes, confident nods, a voice just loud enough to command attention without seeming to ask for it. But the room truly shifted when Lena Hartley returned. She had stepped away briefly, just long enough for the anticipation to grow, and when she re-entered, it was with the kind of timing that couldn't be taught. The doors at the side of the ballroom opened with a soft hiss, and Lena walked in like she'd rehearsed it 100 times. The room didn't gasp. This wasn't a soap opera. But something happened. A stillness. A blink. A moment of awareness, as if the temperature had risen by a few degrees. She wore a deep red gown, the fabric clinging to her like intention. It wasn't just the color, it was the way she moved. Poised, not naive. The room had seen beautiful women before. But this was something curated. As she crossed the floor toward Thomas, time seemed to slow. Heads turned. Eyes followed. Conversations faltered. She met Thomas in the center of the room. He took her hand, as if it were a natural thing to do. "Perfect timing," he murmured. "I figured," she said with a smile that was both shy and certain. Thomas took 2 glasses of champagne from a passing tray, handed one to her, and raised his glass slightly. Not to the crowd, not yet. Just to her. To new beginnings. He said softly. She tapped his glass. And clean slates. To anyone watching, it could have been a gesture of mentorship, a CEO welcoming a promising young talent into the fold. But no one was fooled. Not really. In the far corner, Mason Drew watched with a frown so faint it could have been mistaken for thoughtfulness. But it wasn't thought. It was calculation. He didn't need to read the room, he could feel it. Something was off. Something dangerous. Lena, meanwhile, was soaking in the room's energy. It wasn't just the luxury, it was the power. She brushed fingertips along the edge of a silver tray, smiled graciously at a city councilwoman she didn't recognize, and nodded thoughtfully when introduced to a tech CEO she'd only ever seen in headlines. To her, this was not a gala, it was an ascension. She had grown up in a small town in Vermont, where gala meant school dances and cheese cubes on paper plates. But Lena had always known she was meant for more. She used to practice speaking in a mirror, imagining what she'd say to men in suits. Now, here she was, the girl from nowhere, wrapped in silk, standing beside the man whose signature could shift markets. And yet, not all attention felt like praise. Near the refreshments, Elliot Vaughn stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't stare, he didn't frown, but his eyes followed everything like a chess master reading the board 10 moves ahead. He watched as Thomas placed his hand gently on the small of Lena's back, a possessive gesture, almost imperceptible. But Elliot caught it. So did half the room, and the looks began. Tight smiles, raised brows, whispers behind napkins. The unspoken lines had been crossed, and the crowd was doing what it always did, calculating the risk of proximity. Who is she? Isn't his wife pregnant? She's the intern, right bold, even for him. But Thomas didn't care, or maybe he thought this was strength owning his decisions, daring the room to judge him. He tapped a spoon gently against his glass, calling for silence. The chatter dimmed, the music softened. Thomas raised his voice, steady and rich. Friends, colleagues, partners. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate another incredible year for Stratus Ventures. A murmur of polite applause. We've achieved milestones this year that few thought possible. Innovation, expansion, resilience. But beyond the numbers, what drives our success is the people. He glanced at Lena. The dreamers, the builders, the ones brave enough to challenge the norm. Some in the crowd sipped their drinks a little faster. To that spirit, he continued, and to the future. Let's raise a glass. To the future, Lena echoed softly, her glass raised beside his. But in the silence that followed, a single sound broke the moment. A door opened far across the ballroom, not the kind guests used, the kind that demanded attention. The ballroom didn't go quiet. It froze. That kind of stillness where every breath feels louder than it should, and time slows not out of grace, but out of shock. All eyes turned toward the doors that had just opened at the far end of the room. The wide archway framed her like a portrait in a gilded museum. Camille Rayner stood tall, still, and stunning. She wore a deep forest green gown that draped over her pregnant belly like silk armor. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek knot, revealing her face, calm, unreadable, and unshaken. Her presence filled the space without a single word. To those who knew her, she looked like Camille, but not the Camille they expected. Not the quiet wife waiting at home, not the glowing woman confined to bed rest. No. This was Camille, as they had never seen her before, regal, composed, and unmistakably intentional. Whispers fluttered through the air like nervous butterflies. Oh my God, is that... She's supposed to be on bed rest. I thought she wasn't coming. What is she doing here? The whispers were met with wide eyes and tight throats, but Camille wasn't alone. At her side was Elliot Vaughn, stately in a midnight navy suit, his expression set with purpose. Behind them, slowly fanning into the room like a silent tide, came three more members of the Stratus Ventures board of directors: Janice McAllister, Edward Bishop, and Harlan Green. All respected, all rarely seen in public functions, all wearing faces that meant business. No one said a word. They didn't need to. The formation was declaration enough. They weren't here for drinks. They weren't here for pleasantries. They were here for something else. Across the ballroom, Thomas Rayner stood frozen beside Lena. His champagne flute dangled awkwardly in his hand, the bubbles rising without purpose now. His lips parted slightly, but no words formed. He had expected the night to bend to his will, but now, the room was bending around her. Lena shifted slightly. She had followed his gaze and now stood staring, wide-eyed, at Camille. A realization began to take root. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't a jealous wife causing a scene. This was strategy. This was warfare in a velvet dress. Near the refreshment table, Mason Drew whispered under his breath. She came. Beside him, Janice McAllister gave a single nod, her eyes never leaving Camille. She's not here to argue, Mason said. She's here to end it. And he wasn't wrong, because Camille wasn't just walking into a party. She was walking into a stage. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. Every step echoed slightly on the polished floor, measured and calm. Her eyes scanned the room, not in anger, not in grief, but with the quiet command of someone who had prepared for this. Guests parted as she walked past. Some offered awkward smiles. Others looked away, caught in the gravity of her presence. No one knew what to say. This wasn't the kind of scandal you whispered about over dessert. This was the kind that unfolded live with all its devastating beauty. By the bar, a couple stood in tight conversation. She's 8 months pregnant, the man whispered. She's glowing, the woman replied, eyes locked on Camille, but not like a mother-to-be, like a queen. Back at center stage, Thomas attempted a smile thin, hollow. Camille, he called out, voice a touch too loud. This is a surprise. Camille stopped. She didn't speak, not yet. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was orchestral. She held it like a conductor before the final crescendo. And in that stillness, people began to see. really see. They saw the flush on Thomas's face. They saw the way Lena's red gown no longer shimmered. It screamed. It didn't look glamorous anymore. It looked cheap, too loud, too young. They saw the board flanking Camille like a fortress. And suddenly, the room remembered something Thomas had made them forget. Camille wasn't decoration. She was foundation. The woman who had helped write the first investor pitch, who'd sat in late-night meetings when Stratus was still an idea on napkins, who knew the names of assistants, not just executives. This wasn't a woman who'd been left behind. This was a woman who had stepped aside and now returned with purpose. From the back of the room, a senior legal associate leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "This is bad. Not yet." The other murmured, "But it's about to be." Camille looked at Thomas for the first time since stepping into the room. Her eyes didn't flare with betrayal. They glimmered with truth. And then, for just a moment, her gaze drifted to Lena, not with cruelty, not with jealousy, but with clarity, as if to say, "You don't even know what game you're in." The murmurs returned, but quieter this time, different, less like gossip and more like awe. Some guests turned to one another in disbelief. Some instinctively checked their phones, but no one dared move for the exit, because this wasn't just drama. This was consequence. Camille didn't need an invitation. The room might have belonged to Thomas by design, but at this moment, it bent around her. She walked forward, not fast, not slow, just certain. The board members followed a half step behind her like shadows cast by power. Thomas set down his champagne glass with a faint clink, his throat tightening as he adjusted his collar. His voice, usually so steady, cracked just slightly. "Camille," he said, trying again, "you really shouldn't be on your feet." His words floated in the air, thin and meaningless. Camille didn't respond right away. She took her place just before the low platform where he stood, her presence now commanding the height without needing it. The crowd instinctively created a ring around them. Space, breathless and thick. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said softly, her voice clear and even. The calm in her tone wasn't weakness, it was control. Thomas's jaw worked, his eyes darting quickly to Lena, then to Elliot Vaughn, then back to Camille. He tried a smile. "You're making a scene." "No," Camille said, still serene. "You did that when you walked in here with her." Lena shifted uncomfortably, her red gown suddenly feeling 2 sizes too tight. She tried to step back, but Thomas caught her hand without thinking. Camille noticed, but didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, the way she used to when solving a complex equation in her mind. "You should let her go," she said quietly. Thomas hesitated, then slowly released Lena's hand. She didn't move far, just enough to no longer be tethered. "You don't understand what's happening here," Thomas said under his breath, though loud enough for those close to hear. "This is a business event, not the place." "This is the place," Camille interrupted, still soft, but unwavering. "This is exactly the place, because this is where it began, and it's where it ends." Gasps fluttered like bird wings. Someone at the edge of the room whispered, "She's taking him down right here." Elliot stepped forward now, clearing his throat not to speak, but to punctuate the moment. Behind him, the other board members stood like granite statues. Mason Drew joined them silently, his expression unreadable. Thomas's eyes flicked from face to face, his smile faltering into something else, uncertainty. For the first time in years, he looked like a man unsure of the room he was standing in. Camille looked directly at him now. No rage, no tears, only clarity. "You built this company on risk," she said, "on charm, on disruption. And for a long time, that worked." Thomas straightened, grasping at the last threads of authority. "It still works." Camille shook her head gently. "No, it worked because people trusted you, because we built something together. But you stopped honoring that the day you decided your ambition mattered more than your integrity." He opened his mouth, but she raised her hand, a simple, graceful gesture, and he stopped. "I'm not here to beg you for anything," she continued. "I'm not even here because of her. She nodded once toward Lena, who looked as though she wished the ground would open beneath her. I'm here because you made decisions that endangered more than just our marriage. You gambled with the company's future, with people's livelihoods, with our child's legacy. She placed a hand on her belly. The gesture was not sentimental. It was declarative. A claim. A stake. Thomas stepped forward, lowering his voice. Camille, we can talk about this. In private. No, she said. We won't, because the damage wasn't done in private. The room went still again. Thomas looked around, seeking allies, but found only watching eyes, silent, calculating, waiting. He tried again. Whatever you think you know, I know, she said, sharper now, and so do they. She gestured to the board behind her. Elliot gave a nod. Mason followed. Thomas's chest rose and fell faster now. You planned this, he said, the color draining from his face. Camille didn't deny it. She stepped up onto the platform level with him now, face to face. And for the first time, Thomas looked small. This isn't revenge, Camille said. This is accountability. The word echoed. It didn't shout, it resonated. People began to shift, not away, but forward, drawn in, like gravity had shifted. Camille looked out across the room, at investors, at employees, at friends and strangers. She had once stood in the background of these events, smiling, quiet, proud. But now she stood center stage, and she wasn't going anywhere. Thomas Rayner had always been the center of gravity. Rooms turned to face him. Boardrooms waited on his opinion. Investors leaned in when he spoke. He moved through life like someone who had already won, simply deciding each day which version of victory he'd display, but not tonight. Tonight. He stood on a platform meant for celebration, and instead, it felt like a stage built for judgment. Camille hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't wept or raged. And yet, everything about her presence had cracked the illusion he so carefully constructed. And now he felt it, the slow, suffocating collapse. The hush in the room was no longer reverent. It was chilling. Executives looked away. Friends found their drinks suddenly fascinating. Even the chandelier above seemed too bright, spotlighting a man beginning to come undone. Beside him, Lena Hartley remained still, her hands at her sides, fingers curled ever so slightly. The red dress she had chosen so carefully now clung like a scarlet mistake. She didn't meet Camille's eyes. She didn't look at Thomas either. She was beginning to understand. She had thought this night would be her debut, the unveiling of a new role in a new life. Instead, she was collateral, a symbol of the recklessness Camille had just dismantled with a voice as soft as a lullaby. Camille turned slightly, addressing the room now, not just her husband. When you build something together, when you sacrifice sleep, dreams, and years, it isn't just a business, she said, her voice calm, measured. It becomes part of who you are. She paused, letting the silence breathe. But when one of you forgets that, when one of you decides the rules don't apply anymore, the cost is more than financial. She looked back to Thomas. It's personal. It's legacy. It's trust. Thomas's lips moved, but the words didn't come. He had prepared speeches before, statements, press releases, damage control protocols. But he had never prepared for this, not for her. He glanced at the board. Elliot Vaughn, unreadable but firm. Janice McAllister, arms crossed. Harlan Green, expression neutral but tight-lipped. And then there was Mason Drew, who looked not angry, but disappointed, almost like a brother watching someone he once admired fall. The weight of their gaze hit harder than any headline ever could. Camille continued, now stepping fully onto the platform, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband, not as his partner, but as his counterpoint. I stayed quiet for a long time, she said. Not because I was weak, but because I believed silence could still protect something. She looked down at her belly, then back at Thomas. But silence only protects what's sacred if both people value it. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft, like the edge of a wave. Thomas finally spoke, his voice cracked and dry. Camille, please. It wasn't a command. It was a whisper, a plea. She turned to him, eyes steady. You don't have to beg. You just have to face it. And now the shift was complete. Thomas Rayner, the man who once bent investors to his will with a grin, now stood trembling under a woman's quiet reckoning. And Lena sweet, ambitious, naive. Lena felt the chill of irrelevance slip over her like a second skin. She took a small step back, then another. Eyes followed her as she moved, no longer admired, now simply observed, not with cruelty, but with detachment. She had become a footnote before her story even began. Camille watched her go with no malice, just truth. She turned back to the crowd. I don't expect applause, or sides, but I do expect truth to matter again. She looked down at her hand, resting on her belly. And I expect that this company, this place we all built, will be led by people who remember where they came from. Elliot stepped forward now, his voice like a low drumbeat. Effective immediately, he said, turning to the board. We're entering executive session. All non-essential personnel. Please exit the ballroom. The finality in his tone was unmistakable. Guests moved slowly at first, then with growing urgency, heels on marble, murmurs, glasses set down, like a theater emptying after the final act, except no one clapped. Camille stayed where she was. She hadn't won, but she had arrived. Not as a wife clinging to a crumbling marriage, not as a woman seeking revenge, but as someone who finally stood fully in her own name. The room had been cleared, save for those who mattered most now. Camille remained on the platform. She didn't pace. She didn't posture. She simply stood as if her stillness alone was enough to anchor the space. Across from her, Thomas Rayner sat on a stool someone had placed near the bar, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers pressed to his temples like they could stop time. They couldn't. Around them stood Elliot Vaughn, Mason Drew, Janice McAllister, Harlan Green, and Edward Bishop, the full board of Stratus Ventures. No longer party guests. Now witnesses, prosecutors, judges, and Camille. She wasn't here for vengeance. She was here for clarity. Thomas, she began, her voice low and firm. This isn't just about betrayal. It's about what you thought you could get away with. He didn't respond, not with words, only the slow, desperate shift of his shoulders. Camille stepped forward, a file in her hands, thin, clean, lethal. I've spent the last 6 weeks gathering this, she said, not out of spite, but out of necessity. You've been siphoning funds from operational budgets into shell accounts tied to a project codenamed Atria. Thomas finally lifted his head. His face was pale, jaw tight. I was investing in a side innovation stream, he said, his voice hoarse. R&D. Camille nodded once. An innovation stream with zero oversight, no board review, no trial phase documentation, just transfers, signed by you alone, to companies that don't exist except on paper. She handed the folder to Elliot. He opened it wordlessly. There are 5 shell entities, Camille continued, all registered under alternate holding companies with addresses traced back to a P.O. box in Delaware. The kicker. She paused, locking eyes with Thomas. 3 of them were once briefly linked to your college roommate, the one who helped you with early crypto investments. Thomas said nothing. Camille's tone softened, but not out of pity, out of precision. You didn't think anyone would look. You assumed that, because you built the image of the fearless visionary, no one would question you. Mason spoke next, his voice steady. I started noticing the numbers about 2 quarters ago. He said, they didn't add up, but they weren't big enough to raise alarms until last month. Janice added, you authorized a $1.2 million transfer on a Sunday, through a secure line, labeled as consulting fee. There was no contract, no vendor ID. Camille stepped closer now, the room holding its breath. I followed that trail. It led to an account with only 2 authorized users, one of whom, she paused, was listed as L. Hartley, Lena. The room pulsed with a new kind of tension. She didn't know, Camille clarified, at least not fully, but you used her name. Her laptop probably convinced her it was a perk, a tool, something to help her work remotely. You underestimated her too. Thomas finally stood, his hands trembling slightly. I never touched investor funds, he said, voice rising. Everything was covered internally through bonuses, temporary liquidity solutions which you were never authorized to issue, Elliot said coldly. You've exposed this company to audit violations, potential SEC scrutiny, and if we dig deeper, criminal liability. The word criminal hung like smoke in the air. Camille didn't blink. You tried to erase me from your life, she said, but in doing so, you also erased the checks and balances I helped build. You removed the one person who actually kept you grounded, and now you've lost your balance completely. Thomas's voice cracked again, this time with something resembling fear. This was our company. Camille nodded slowly. Yes, it was. Until you made it yours alone. And now, you don't even have that. She turned toward Elliot, then Mason. I'm not here to destroy what we built, but I am here to protect it. For the people who work here, for the investors, for the future. She placed one final document on the table beside Elliot, a motion for Thomas's removal, effective immediately. Elliot looked at it, then at the others. Mason didn't hesitate. I second. Janice lifted her chin, all in favor one by one. The hands rose. Thomas didn't try to stop them, he just watched. As the empire he thought he controlled was quietly, systematically removed from his grasp. Camille stepped down from the platform. She didn't look back. Not once. Thomas Rayner sat in the center of the storm, but for the first time, he realized he had never seen it coming. He thought he'd controlled the board. He thought he'd controlled the story. But Camille had been building something behind the silence, and now, piece by piece, it unfolded before him. After the vote was cast, and the motion for his removal passed without dissent, the room didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no celebration, just the quiet shifting of power. Camille remained composed, her hands resting gently on her belly. But her eyes held the storm Thomas had ignored for too long. You still don't see it, do you? She asked softly. Thomas met her gaze, something broken, flickering behind his. I don't understand, he said. You were resting, you were distant, you weren't involved. Camille almost smiled, not cruelly, but with a sadness that belonged to someone who had been underestimated one too many times. I wasn't distant, she replied. You just stopped looking. She turned to the board and gave a small nod. Elliot stepped forward, holding a new file, this one marked Confidential Internal Risk Assessment. Camille brought concerns to me 6 weeks ago, he said calmly. At first, I thought they were personal, understandable, given the circumstances. But then I saw the numbers. Thomas blinked. You worked with her. Elliot didn't blink. She's the co-founder's wife. She has a 12% holding stake through her family's trust, and more importantly, she's the only one who's been asking the right questions. Thomas turned sharply toward Mason Drew, betrayal clear in his voice. You too. Mason sighed. I wasn't sure at first, but when Camille showed me the ledger overlays, the offshore invoices, I ran the numbers. She was right. I trusted you, Thomas said. You trusted no one. Mason replied, that's what got you here. Camille moved closer now, not aggressive, but present. There's one more person, she said. Someone who doesn't speak much in these rooms, but someone who's been watching you longer than anyone else. A door opened at the side of the ballroom, and a tall man in a dark, tailored suit entered, silver-haired, quiet, eyes like winter steel. Charles Alden, her uncle. Thomas's jaw tensed. I thought he was retired. He is, Camille said, from public finance, not from protecting his family. Charles stepped forward and placed a hand gently on Camille's shoulder. The gesture said everything. We had dinner. You and I, Thomas said weakly, remembering the brief meeting at a holiday gathering years ago. You told me you believed in me. I believed in the us you and Camille once were, Charles said. Then I watched what you became. Thomas turned to Camille, struggling. All of this. It was coordinated. She nodded. Yes. Quietly. carefully, not out of malice, but because I had to. She took a breath. When you ignored my voice, I found others who would listen. When you pushed me aside, I stepped back not to disappear, but to prepare. She looked toward Lena now, who remained near the wall, her expression unreadable. I didn't do this to punish you, Camille said to Thomas. I did this so our child won't grow up in a house where lies are considered leadership. She turned to the board once more. And I did it so this company doesn't fall because one man thought he was the only one that mattered. Elliot nodded. Charles spoke now, his voice low and commanding. This isn't just about numbers, Thomas. It's about the culture you tried to remake in your image. But leadership isn't about dominance, it's about trust. And trust can't be built on secrecy. Thomas's shoulders sagged, all his shortcuts, all his bravado, all the moves he'd made thinking no one could touch him. Undone by the woman he thought would never raise her voice, by the allies he never thought she had, by the quiet hands behind the curtain who moved not for power, but for protection. The room was too quiet, not the kind of quiet that invites peace, but the kind that presses on your chest, heavy, cold, irreversible. Thomas Rayner stood in the hollowed center of what used to be his world. The board no longer looked at him as a leader. They looked at him like an equation that no longer balanced. The empire he had spent years building, brick by shimmering brick, was gone. No fire, no explosion, just silence. The worst kind. He tried to speak, but his throat refused cooperation. His hands trembled at his sides, no longer capable of commanding attention with the lift of a glass or a firm handshake. He looked to Elliot Vaughn. No help there. To Mason Drew. Nothing. To Camille, his wife, his former partner, the woman whose eyes once reflected belief in him. Now they reflected only stillness. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Thomas muttered, barely audible. Camille didn't answer. That was worse than shouting. He took a step forward, then faltered. The floor beneath him seemed uneven, as though the room itself was pulling away. I thought I could fix it, he said. Louder now. I just needed more time. Another quarter. The Atria project, it was close to a breakthrough. You forged records, said Janice McAllister, flatly. You compromised employee pensions, Harlan Green added. You used your intern's credentials to disguise personal transfers, Elliot finished. Each sentence landed like a blow. Thomas's face flushed, then paled. He turned to Lena Hartley, who stood like a shadow near the edge of the room. Her arms were crossed tightly, her lips trembling. Lena, he said softly. You know I didn't mean for... But Lena looked away. And in that tiny gesture, something inside him cracked. It wasn't just the company. It wasn't just the finances. It was his illusion, the belief that he was untouchable, that charisma could cover calculation, that ambition excused betrayal. He looked at Camille one last time. I didn't want to lose everything, he said, his voice rough, broken. Camille tilted her head, just slightly. Then, maybe, she said gently, you should have remembered what everything really was. It wasn't cruel. It was truth. And truth had a way of echoing longer than any judgment. Thomas's knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to the edge of a chair to steady himself. The strength that once surged through his voice, his stride, his brand was gone. In its place was a man left with nothing but the memory of power. Camille stepped back, allowing Charles Alden to step forward. We'll arrange for a legal transition, Charles said. You'll be given one opportunity to cooperate. Otherwise, criminal proceedings will begin. Thomas nodded, almost imperceptibly. Not in agreement, in surrender. He turned slowly, gathering what little dignity remained, and began walking toward the side door. Not the grand exit through which he had entered in triumph, but a smaller one, quieter, dimly lit, the kind of exit no one photographed. As he passed Lena, he didn't reach for her, and she didn't stop him. When the door closed behind him, it wasn't a slam. It was soft, final. For a moment, no one spoke. Camille closed her eyes. Her hand rested on her belly. There was no applause, no relief, just the weight of what had been reclaimed and what still needed to be rebuilt. The ballroom was almost unrecognizable now. Gone were the glittering distractions, the surface-level applause, the laughter that had once echoed through the chandeliers. What remained was something quieter and stronger. Camille Rayner stood at the center of that stillness. She had not ascended to the platform like Thomas once did. She had not cleared her throat or tapped a glass to summon attention. She didn't need to, because everyone was already listening. Around her stood the board members, now silent witnesses to something unexpected. Not a coup, not a coronation, but a restoration. Camille looked out at the remaining faces: executives, legal staff, senior investors, longtime employees who had once assumed her silence meant irrelevance. She saw the disbelief softening into recognition. "I never wanted this," Camille began, her voice warm but resolute. "I never dreamed of standing here, in this moment, under these circumstances." She paused. Let the truth sit in the room. But here we are. A few people shifted, eyes drawn to her not by drama, but by gravity. I was content to stand behind the scenes. She continued, to advise, to support, to shape things quietly. And maybe that was my mistake. No one interrupted. No one looked away. For years, I believed that being invisible meant being safe, that if I didn't demand attention, the work would speak for itself. She looked down for a moment, then back up. But silence doesn't always protect what matters. And turning a blind eye to what we know is wrong, whether in our homes or in our companies, is a kind of betrayal too. There was no anger in her voice, only reflection, ownership, growth. And so, tonight, I take responsibility, she said, not just for uncovering what went wrong, but for what comes next. She stepped forward slightly, her presence calm but magnetic. This company was never meant to belong to one person. Stratus Ventures was built on vision, but it will survive on values. Elliot Vaughn gave a subtle nod. Camille continued, "Leadership is not about domination. It's about stewardship, listening, adapting, and choosing integrity, even when it's inconvenient." She glanced at Mason Drew, who met her gaze with a look of quiet respect. "From this day forward, Stratus will lead with transparency, with accountability, with a renewed focus on people, not just profit." She placed a hand on her belly, and her voice softened. "Because the future we build isn't just for quarterly reports, it's for our children, for the world they'll inherit." The room remained silent, but the energy had changed. No more tension, only the steady heartbeat of hope. "I will serve as interim CEO," she said, "not because I want the title, but because I want to ensure this transition is done with care, with fairness, and with a commitment to healing what was broken." A soft breath moved through the crowd, relief, agreement, maybe even admiration. Camille looked around once more. "I know there are people in this room who doubted me," she said. "Some of you still do. That's fair. Trust must be earned again." She paused, letting that truth land. "But I'm not asking you to follow me out of loyalty. I'm asking you to follow the vision we all once believed in." She stepped back. "And if that's not enough, then follow the numbers, follow the impact, follow the proof we can do better." The room remained quiet, and then one by one, people began to nod, not quickly, but slowly, genuinely. Elliot stepped forward and spoke, his voice low and clear. "On behalf of the board, we support this transition. Camille Rayner will assume interim leadership with full authority until a permanent structure is approved." No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of night. But what moved through the room was more powerful than applause. It was alignment, not forced, but chosen. Camille turned slightly, her eyes moving to the hallway where Thomas had vanished. There was no victory in her gaze, just clarity and peace. The ballroom was nearly empty now. The echoes of high heels and hushed voices had faded into soft silence, like a storm that had passed without ever needing to shout. Outside, the Manhattan skyline blinked in quiet rhythm, unconcerned by what had just unfolded inside the Whitmore Hotel. Cities never paused, but hearts did. Camille Rayner remained, standing alone beneath the chandeliers, her hand resting gently on her belly. The light above her no longer spotlighted a confrontation. It cradled a beginning. The staff moved quietly in the background, clearing glasses, folding napkins, avoiding eye contact not out of shame, but out of reverence. Elliot Vaughn approached her one last time before leaving. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside her, watching the way she exhaled slowly, deeply, like she hadn't breathed fully in months. "You did what needed to be done," he said softly. Camille nodded. "Yes, but that doesn't make it easy." "No," he said, "but it does make it right." He gave a small, respectful nod, then turned and left without ceremony. There would be press statements to draft, meetings to reschedule, investors to reassure, but tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, something more important had been restored. Camille walked toward the platform once more, not to speak, but to pick up the folder Thomas had dropped. Inside were the final signatures, the proof of his resignation. She didn't look at the papers. She just closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. She'd read them in the morning. For now, it was time to go home. She made her way toward the main doors, the same doors through which Thomas had once entered with pride and left in shame. But as she reached for the handle, a voice behind her paused her step. "Camille." It was Lena Hartley. The young woman stood a few feet away, holding her own clutch bag with both hands, her posture unsure, her expression heavy with something that looked like humility. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Camille turned fully to face her. "I didn't know everything," Lena said, her voice fragile, "but I knew enough, and I let myself believe he was someone he wasn't." Camille nodded slowly. "We all believe stories when we need to," she said gently. "The hard part is knowing when to stop." Lena's eyes filled, but she held the tears back. "I never meant to be the reason something broke." "You weren't," Camille said. "You were just the last crack in a foundation that had been shifting for a long time." Lena looked away. Camille stepped closer, not to offer comfort, but something better, a kind of release. "I don't hate you," she said softly. Lena looked up, surprised. "I just hope," Camille added, "that next time you see the warning signs, you don't ignore them." Lena nodded, tears finally spilling. "Thank you." Camille offered a faint smile. "Go home." "Lena, this story's not yours to carry." And with that, Lena turned and left into the New York night, one of many who had come to that gala hoping for something different than what they got. Camille stood for a moment longer, then stepped out into the cool air herself. Outside, a black car waited. Charles Alden stood beside it, holding the door open like a quiet sentinel. As she slid into the seat, he closed the door with care, then joined her in the back. "You didn't just salvage a company tonight," he said. Camille looked out the window. "I didn't just fight for a company," she replied. "I fought for a future, one that's cleaner, quieter, wiser." Charles gave a short nod. "You've earned it." "No," she said. "I've begun it." The car pulled away from the curb. The city lights shimmered outside the window, but Camille wasn't looking at them anymore. She had spent too long watching someone else's dream burn bright. Now it was her turn to build something lasting, not just for herself, but for the child moving quietly inside her, the heartbeat she carried into every room, the future she would now protect with everything she had learned. Because the best victories, Camille had come to understand, weren't loud. They were steady, earned, and whispered into the bones of the world by women who refused to disappear. In the quiet strength of Camille's story, we find a lesson many of us learn, too late sometimes. Love asks us to be still, but dignity asks us to stand. This isn't just about betrayal in a marriage or deceit in business. It's about what happens when we give so much of ourselves that we begin to disappear, and what it takes to come back. For anyone who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside, It reminds us that silence is not always peace, that standing up for truth, even after years of sacrifice, is not an act of pride, but of healing. Camille's journey shows that grace and strength are not opposites. They can live in the same heart, and that it's never too late to reclaim your story, not out of anger, but to protect what truly matters: your values, your voice, your future. For those of us in later chapters of life, it's a call to remember that we're never too old to choose courage, and that sometimes the most powerful act is simply refusing to stay silent. DEILAONLICMN va QGE hanna nung NGN chan tan va kiem suk pu HP fong catch ta ken. Thank you for staying with us through this story. If it touched your heart, made you reflect, or reminded you of your own strength, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that heal, connect, and inspire. We're grateful to have you here, and we can't wait to walk with you in the next story.